This podcast is brought to you by the Southern African Institute of Government Auditors. And as we've promised you in the past, that we will be bringing you interesting and important topics as well as influential people in the sector. And my guest this time around is the president of SAIGA, Mr. Phillip Rakgwale. I'm talking to him in particular regarding the presentation that he gave at the Audit and Finance Indaba that was held recently, where he spoke to us about the emerging trends in the public sector audits, specifically addressing the MFMA as well as the PFMA. Now, Mr. Phillip Rakgwale, thank you very much for joining me and going through the presentation once again with you. Pleasure.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, what were the key observations that you made emerging from the trends that you focused on over the past 3 years?
I think one of the emerging trends across the municipalities that one observed is that if you focus on local governments per se, I'll touch on the departments now, is that this is generally a lack of non-compliance with supply chain, which causes what we call material irregularities. And when you look deeper into the things, is that most of the communities don't get what we call service delivery. So it's either payments were made and services were never delivered or goods never arrived for whatever reasons are. And then if you also look deeper in terms of the issues of losses in the municipalities as well, is the issue of irregular expenditure. So simply put, is that you have a situation where processes are not followed and causes irregular expenditure. Me and you, we can guess many ways why the process will not be followed, but it disadvantages many suppliers, especially local suppliers. So earlier on, I had a similar discussion with the Gauteng province. We had a forum that I was presenting in. And one of the key things that came as well is that 90% of the irregular expenditure is not investigated. And it's just one of those things that is not investigated. One can guess many reasons why. And then one of the issues as well is that we have a lot of false declaration by suppliers when they are tendering for government work. And obviously some of them we found that obviously they are working for government, which defeats the whole purpose of transparency and economical way of doing it in terms of Constitution, Section 217 of the Constitution. It's really not having issues of competitiveness because we've got people who are working for government who've got inside information in terms of the going on of supply chain. And then if we move over to the national government and provincial government, I would say our biggest issues is SOEs because as we know, some of them have actually failed in terms of executing their mandate. But their key things is transparency. There is no transparency in terms of financial statements being prepared on time. Some SOEs, they've got like 5 years of backlog of financial statements, including SAA, which is a topical one. And the biggest issue about it is that where there is no financial statements, then people cannot account. We are eventually going to elections on the 29th May, but those big SOEs have not accounted. You talk about your DNL, your SAA, the whole group of SAA, for example. So, but there's others as well, which are also culprits of not accounting. So that's the biggest issue when coming to SOEs. When you come into issues of departments, you've got they call it high impact service delivery departments. So you talk about your education, you talk about your health, you talk about transport and so forth. So the big ones that takes the biggest chunk of the budget as it normally is presented. But the problem about them is that Firstly, they've got an issue of supply chain, again, as you find in local government. So their biggest issue is non-compliant supply chain. Secondly, you've got issues that non-achievement of key indicators. So let's just take for education, for example. Building of schools and not having mud schools. They don't achieve that. And also, on top of it, they cannot be able to give you evidence of whatever they claim to have done. So if you look at human settlements as well, human settlements has got a similar issue of title deeds that normally would have distributed so many title deeds and so many people would have got houses. But those ones, if we ask for evidence in terms of supporting that, is quite also a problematic issue. So I'm just making an example of that. So for example, if you take issues of roads, which falls under your transport, and they tell you that they've built so many roads of so many kilometers, but if you say, can you support your statement in terms of your reporting, the evidence is not there. So it's also a question to the issue that if the evidence is not there, then what happened to the funds that was appropriated for such services? So there's a common issue of accountability which is not really being addressed properly. That's you, Tim.
I want to go back to an earlier statement you made that there is never follow-up or proper investigations where irregularities are found. Why is that the case? Who is supposed to investigate when and how?
In actual sense, accounting officers are supposed to make sure that the investigation happens. Normally, in any government institution, you'll have either head of internal audit or the forensic head who will be investigating, but they get a mandate from the accounting officer. So most of the things that also, I think it's an interesting question that you actually asked me, because most of the things, if you look at the AG report, they talk about the amended powers, which is material irregularities, which eventually comes from procurement. And one of the things is that they tell the accounting officer, please go and investigate this. Most of the time, accounting officers don't take that message very seriously, which then kind of forces AG's hand to issue a remedial action, kind of finding to them, which is normally binding. The only thing I think that's missing is the certificate of debt towards the accounting officers on the losses that they were incurred, because it's just the issue of willingness. What they do with the investigation afterwards it's anyone's guess, but the most important thing is that the investigations are not happening at the pace that it should be happening, because the problem is that once it takes longer to investigate, most of the time the accounting officer would have changed, or the people who are responsible for such acts are no longer in the employ, or even the suppliers, they are out of business. So there's no recourse really for wrongdoing if you look at it, the whole value chain. So it's present a very difficult situation of holding people accountable, and accounting officers are at the core of it. We tend to really put it towards the political heads and saying political heads are meddling with the administration. But in essence, this is an administrative issue of having an investigation. It's got nothing to do with political heads. They might have their own way of thinking, but the bottom line is administration, especially accounting officers, are not taking the lead in terms of consequence management and ensuring accountability.
Are the professionals appointed to these positions appropriately qualified from your findings, from your investigation?
Look, it's a difficult question because the data is not available. I've heard a lot of professionalization. I mean, I think it's everywhere that the government is moving professionalization, which is a good thing, and which is across all the spheres, and we support that. But if you ask me if there's the adequate skills assessment by government to tell you, for example, how many CFOs and municipal managers and DGs and so forth, people who are in senior management have adequate qualification, there isn't that data. The last time they did that data, it was, I think, the time of Minister of Pravin Gordhan at that time. That's a long time ago. That data is outdated. But just to give you a sense as well, is that there was a recent assessment done by SAIGA, which looks at whether our councillors themselves are actually qualified, and majority of them, we found that they don't have the appropriate qualifications. Some don't even know how to read and write. So it tells you that any document that is presented to them, it's as good as it gets. So there's no proper oversight. So if you take it to, and if I take to that old assessment that was made, majority of our accounting officers didn't have proper qualification, a lot of them, and also the chief financial officers. So it was an outcry back then. But government has tried to put processes in place to make it mandatory to do certain courses like senior management program for you to be able to occupy those positions. But until government do a full assessment of people who are in seats of senior management, then it's anybody's guess. But judging from the outcome of the audits outcomes that we have, it doesn't look like. For example, one of the biggest issues that AG keeps on raising is the issue of consultants, right? So the issue of consultants is that you've got a fully fledged finance division and department, but then you bring in consultants to give you financial statements, which those financial statements themselves, they still come out with errors in most of the time. So the amount you spend basically is fruitless and wasteful expenditure, which is, if you look at it, you pay the consultant who didn't produce quality, and also you've paid people salaries which you didn't get anything in return. So those are the biggest issues that we have, is that in terms of the theme of professionalization, which we support very much, but I don't think there's enough data to tell what kind of skills is needed out there, and especially at what level those CFOs and accounting officers are.
Let me jump back to the state-owned enterprises that you say some have not presented their financials for years. Who's supposed to hold them accountable? And why are those who are supposed to hold them accountable not doing their work? I know we've got portfolio committees for the different sectors that you have mentioned. I would assume that those portfolio committees in Parliament are supposed to be the ones that are holding the SAAs and DINELs accountable. Why are they not doing that?
Look, that's very, portfolio committees are your far end of the value chain, if I might put it that way, which I will talk about now. But you've got institutions like National Treasury, which they give grants to these SOEs, and sometimes they call them bailouts as well. But they are not holding them accountable, because it's quite simple. And it's the analogy I will put is that it's like giving your children money and not getting anything in return. Obviously, you need to stop their allowance so that they can start listening to you. And that's not what, for example, institutions like National Treasury is doing. And then if you look at in any department, for example, you've got political heads, executives, who are supposed to hold these boards accountable and to make sure that they produce financial statements. When it comes to portfolio committees, I think we all aware that there's also issues of politics that can also get into the way of holding people accountable. And that's been the main issue, that ministers, they go there and they are not really held accountable for their respective portfolios. There's been collapsing SOEs for quite a long time. You talk about your PRAZA, you talk about your Transnet, and Denel and your SAA. So it's not a new thing. So it's from the administrative point of view, you ask yourself why Treasury is not doing anything. Obviously why ministers is not doing anything, and also why oversight committees takes a long time to really come up with a concrete plan of turning them around. Let's just take an example, for example, a recent example of SAA, where there was a Tagasa agreement that was signed to, in terms of the sale of SAA. Only now that the portfolio committee is trying to take concrete steps, one asks why it took a long time for them to even understand what's happening at the SAA in terms of the sale agreement. So it's a value chain that has failed across. So I think if you think about it at an earlier comment of mine to say, if the accounting officer is delinquent, and the senior management is delinquent, and your political head is not interested in turning it around, the whole value chain actually collapses, and nothing really happens. And the other thing is that I think, Tim, the important thing is that it's very difficult to hold people accountable if they move around as well. If you ask me, the first CFO 5 years ago of SAA or Denel, for example, they are no longer there, they are working somewhere else. And it's a new person there who's supposed to do a cleanup. So it becomes very difficult to hold account.
And when you say they move around, and they're likely to still be in the public sector, is that what you mean, for instance?
100%. 100%. That's most of the time.
You work in one institution, maybe, for whatever reasons, the particular official is delinquent. Then when they are about to be disciplined or whatever measures are likely to be taken against them, then they move to another state-owned entity or a public entity. Is that correct?
Yes. They just resign and then get employed somewhere else, which defeats the whole purpose. And I think also, the other thing that also is very important, I always mention as well, especially us who are in the professional bodies, is that professional bodies are also not playing their part of making sure that they take concrete steps against their professionals which are in the public sector, for example. It's a shame to the profession, because once, for example, I'll just make an example. There's been a state capture report. I think the only person that I knew that steps were taken was Anot Singh. And it's in the public eyes. It was published. But the rest of the professions who were at the SOEs and all these other institutions of government who are belonging to professional bodies, I haven't seen anything happening.
Let me ask you, does that require a law for the professional bodies to take action against their own members? Or are the professional bodies equipped to take whatever disciplinary action against their members, those who are found to be delinquent in any way?
They don't need a law. Because, any professional who belongs to any professional bodies, they've got what you call code of conduct. So code of conduct doesn't even need you to have proof beyond reasonable doubt that this person has done this. Any appearance of you being professional delinquent when you're looking at the code of conduct, then you're supposed to be terminated from your membership, and that's your license to trade. And I think that's we need to jack up that aspect. But on the other side of the coin, Tim, before I lose the train of thought, is that especially when it comes to CFOs, it must be mandatory in government positions that they must belong to a professional bodies as well, because majority of them are not. and there's no repercussions to their behavior. And then you wait for a court process that will take forever. I mean, it takes about more than 5 years to you be prosecuted, and nothing really has happened to you in the space. So there's two sides. The other side is that professional bodies must really act. They don't need any legal law or anything. They just use their code of conduct on their members. Secondly, on the other side of the coin is that those who are not part of professional bodies, it must be mandatory in terms of government policies as part of the professionalization process.
Let's go back to the service delivery aspect of what you spoke about earlier on. Just use the example that you used at the Audit and Finance Indaba recently, when you spoke about the value chain of water supply. How is the public, or how are communities in South Africa robbed of services as a result of the poor performance of municipalities and state entities, using water as an example?
Yes. So let's use water as an example. And actually water is our next pandemic after load shedding. I think we haven't seen enough disaster than what we see in load shedding. We might think load shedding is the worst thing that ever happened to us. I don't think people have really got hold of what's happening with our water. So in terms of our water, if you look at our water currently, the dams are at the levels that of average of 80%, levels of water available in the dams. The problem then happens is that the water boards, for example, your water boards, your example is your rainwater, Sidibeng water, that they are your water boards. They're supposed to take the water from the dams and then put it in the system of municipalities, and eventually, obviously through the system of municipality, eventually goes to the reservoirs of municipality, and then eventually to us as citizens. So the recent reports by Water Affairs is that firstly, we lose almost half of the water that that gets through the system, because our infrastructure is very poor. So it's either it goes through leaking or it just disappears. They don't know where the water went. So half of the water is obviously wasted. Secondly is that then we look at the issues of the water that comes out of the system. So in the normal course of this, the business, especially in the municipality level, is that you will have a situation where the water goes through the normal process of you drinking it, and then it eventually goes through the sewage system, which then goes to a purification plant in any of the municipalities. Because of the poor quality of our infrastructure, and also just the lack of maintenance of the infrastructure, and also the issues of having appropriate chemicals to clean the water, you find that in many places, in most places, if I might put it that way, the water that you would have sent through a flushing toilet is the same water that will get into the system, and eventually on the other side, obviously going through the taps. So in simple terms, they call it the green drop. Green drop is the water that is purified. It's very low across the country. And the other side of it is the blue drop, which is the water that comes out of your tap. But the problem is that, for example, if you take a province like Northern Cape, for example, Northern Cape, the water there, according to Water Affairs, and it's not us and it's public information, is that that water is not safe for human consumption. So if you go to Northern Cape, the water that comes from the tap is not good for human consumption. You cannot drink it. And you ask yourself, how do people in Northern Cape survive on a day-to-day basis? So what we see, for example, in the Hammaskral issue, in Northern Cape is the norm across the province. If you look at the states that comes from water affairs, so it's not only that we're losing the water, half of it, but it's also that the water that we drink is in a very bad condition because of lack of maintenance of the infrastructure, and also just having capacity to run those plants, and also just having funds to making sure that there's different inputs in terms of chemicals and cleaning that. So yeah, it's a very bad situation, Tim.
Well, as we conclude, and we enumerated several problems, challenges, right, that emerged from the audit or the trends that you looked at when you looked at the audits of the past 3 years, right? Now, going forward, moving from where we are in bullet point form, what do you recommend should happen? What do you think can help improve the situation?
Look, the first one, which I think I support very much, is professionalization of the public sector. I don't think it's enough that it should stop only at senior management. I think politicians also should have a minimum kind of requirements to get into the office, because that's where most of the issues starts. So if we can have professionals who are competent, will go a huge mile. Secondly, is that I think our priorities are not at the level they should be. So if you take, for example, just to critique the previous budget, is that we took some money on our reserve at the Reserve Bank to pay debt, but we could have taken that money and improve our infrastructure. So our infrastructure development is quite at a very, very low end. And if it is not improved in a short while, we're going to have disaster after disaster. So our priorities are very wrong as a country. We're not prioritizing the right things. Secondly, and thirdly, if I might say, is that there need to be a reprioritization of the budget. You ask yourself why the policy departments have the biggest budget, but local government does not have funding. So there needs to be a reprioritization of that budget towards the local government than sitting at the policy level, which is national. I think they really need to have a look at it. Secondly, and then fourthly, I think also the issue of consequence management needs to be very thorough. And we should not only see consequence management when we're approaching elections, but we should see consequence management as the norm. As we would have seen from the state capture report, that there was also a suggestion that there should be an institution of anti-corruption. I think that's very important. And we need to be proactive around that, because most of the funds that we have goes either irregular or fruitless, or it just goes missing and nobody can account for it. And then also in a bullet point as well is that there should be a kind of mechanism from stopping people from hopping from one place to another and without accounting for their previous sins where they have left. There needs to be a process in government that will stop that. And also I think the robustness of oversight is very important in this case. Hence, I said too, is that oversight, either you look at those in Cape Town and oversight committees of different portfolios, or you see looking at oversight at the local level, at the council level. There needs to be some precursor in terms of qualification and requirements, because apart from politics will always be there. But if people are able to read what they get and be able to interrogate the information and hold people accountable, it makes everybody life easy. So on top of my mind, those are the things that I think for me they are very key to be addressed. And also I think just to add is that professional bodies really also needs to play a part of guarding those who are their members. And also I think the other thing as well, which I mentioned earlier, is that there must be a requirement that all those who are entrusted in, especially chief financial officers, they should be a member of a professional body or so. There shouldn't be a free-for-all kind of situation where people are not held accountable and so forth. So those are on top of my mind, Tim, as well, is that they are easy wins and they are not difficult. I think we can be able to have a better country than anything else. Yeah.
No. Dr. Phillip Rakgwale, thank you very much for talking to me about your presentation recently and, of course, the recommendations that you've just made. And that about 7 of them, I noted some, and I think they are easy to implement, as you correctly say. But thanks again for helping us hold public officials accountable, like yourself, and for sharing your thoughts on this matter. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much.
And this interview was brought to you by the Southern African Institute of Government Auditors, helping us hold officials accountable and also promoting transparency in our society. Thank you. Until next time.
Another production from Solid Gold Podcasts.